Back in 1921, Carl Jung wrote something that few scholars have dared to really grapple with. He said that the introverted intuitive type is doomed to be misunderstood. Not sometimes, not occasionally, doomed. As if it were a sentence. As if being misunderstood was woven into their very DNA. When I first read that, a chill went down my spine. Because Jung wasn't just making a casual observation, he was revealing a truth that modern psychology still struggles to fully accept. And now, over 100 years later, the neuroscience coming from figures like Andrew Huberman and researchers at Stanford, Harvard, and other leading institutions is proving that Jung was right, that there are brains that process reality in a fundamentally different way, and that these people, estimated to be around 4 billion worldwide, spend their entire lives feeling like no one truly gets them. If you've ever tried to explain how you feel, only to find that the words just won't work. If you've ever looked into someone's eyes and known that even though you're telling the truth, they're still missing the point. This video is going to change the way you see your own mind. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal what Jung discovered about the brains of those born different. And more importantly, I'm going to show you what Andrew Huberman and the latest neuroimaging studies have proven about the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the neural networks that cause some people to simply not be understood by the mainstream world. If this kind of content resonates with you, subscribe now. I bring together connections between Carl Jung and Andrew Huberman that you won't find anywhere else. Jung identified 8 psychological types in his 1921 book, Psychological Types. But he was crystal clear that one of these types was especially problematic. Not problematic in the sense of being defective, problematic in the sense of being difficult to translate to the external world. That type was the introverted intuitive. Jung described this person as someone who sees things that others don't, who perceives patterns, connections, and meanings that completely fly under the radar for most, who has such a deep relationship with their inner world that they often seem disconnected from the outer world. And here's the core issue that Jung identified. When the introverted intuitive tries to talk about what they really perceive, almost no one understands. They're misunderstood. And that's why these individuals learn to keep things to themselves. Jung wasn't being poetic. He was describing a pattern he observed in hundreds of patients over decades. Brilliant, perceptive, profound individuals living in a chronic state of isolation, not by choice, but because of an inability to communicate. Pause for a second and think. How many times have you tried to explain something that seemed so obvious to you, but the other person just couldn't grasp it? How many times have you given up mid-explanation because you realized you were speaking a language that no one around you understood? That's not a coincidence. That's neurology. Recent neuroimaging studies have revealed something that Jung intuited over a century ago. The brains of highly sensitive people, HSPs, which includes a large portion of introverted intuitives, function in a structurally different way, the amygdala. That region of the brain responsible for processing emotions like fear, anxiety, and vigilance shows greater activation in these people. When exposed to negative or emotionally charged images, the amygdala in HSPs fires with much more intensity than in people with typical sensitivity. But here's the detail that most videos on this topic ignore. If the highly sensitive person had a childhood with adequate emotional support, another region of the brain also activates along with the amygdala, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation. This means that highly sensitive people with nurturing childhoods develop a neural system that both feels intensely and regulates that intensity. It's a more complex brain. Not defective, complex. But the majority of highly sensitive people didn't have that support in childhood. And that's where we enter dangerous territory. When the hyperactive amygdala isn't accompanied by a well-developed prefrontal cortex, the person lives in a state of constant hypervigilance. They pick up on everything, every micro-expression, every change in tone of voice, every energy in the environment, and they can't filter it out. They can't ignore it. They can't turn it off. And that's what makes these people seem strange to others. They're responding to stimuli that no one else is even noticing. Let me tell you what Andrew Huberman explained about how perception works in the brain. He said that perception is the ability to take what we're feeling, focus on it, and make sense of it. Perception is essentially any sensation we are paying attention to at any given moment. Now think about this in the context of the highly sensitive brain. While the average person is paying attention to 5 or 10 stimuli in the environment, the person with heightened sensitivity is picking up on 50, 100, 200 stimuli simultaneously. And they didn't choose this. They were born this way. Research shows that multiple brain regions are activated to a greater extent in highly sensitive people. The precuneus, responsible for mental self-representation, the sensory cortices, responsible for perception, the cingulate cortex, responsible for attention, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for cognitive processing, the inferior frontal gyrus, responsible for response inhibition, the claustrum, responsible for sensory integration, the insula, responsible for interoception and empathy, the amygdala and hippocampus, responsible for emotion and memory. All these areas working in overdrive, all at the same time. Now do you understand why these people feel exhausted in social settings? Why they need more time alone to recharge? Why they seem to process everything with a depth that others find exaggerated or dramatic? It's not drama. It's neurochemistry. And here's the part that really blew me away when I studied this. Research indicates that highly sensitive people experience more activity in brain regions associated with depth of processing, reflective thinking, cognitive control, and consciousness. Depth of processing. That's the key. While most people process information on a superficial, fast, automatic level, the highly sensitive brain goes deeper. It can't not go deeper. It's programmed for in-depth analysis. And that comes at a cost, because when you process everything in depth, you see things that others don't. You perceive contradictions that others ignore. You feel tensions that others don't even register. And when you try to communicate these perceptions, you just sound weird, exaggerated, complicated. Carl Jung understood this perfectly when he wrote that the introverted intuitive type sees things so uncommon that they often don't even like to talk about them. And when they do speak, they're so often misunderstood. That super thanks button you see down there, it's not just financial support. It's your way of saying that this connection between Carl Jung and neuroscience matters to you. That you want more insights like this. When you click that golden heart, you're funding research, hours of study, connecting deep psychology with cutting-edge neuroscience, content that academia often keeps separate, but that really should be united. Each super thanks allows me to go deeper into these connections and to bring you more truths that few have the courage to reveal. Now let me show you something that's going to completely change your perspective. Jung didn't just describe the introverted intuitive type. He explained why this type is so difficult to understand. The introverted intuitive can be an artist, a visionary, or an outright eccentric. They have a visionary ideal that reveals strange and mysterious things. They're enigmatic people, almost otherworldly, who often keep themselves apart from mainstream society. They have little interest in explaining or rationalizing their personal vision, contenting themselves merely to proclaim it. And in part, as a result of that, they are frequently misunderstood. Did you catch that? Contenting themselves merely to proclaim it. That is the key. The introverted intuitive isn't trying to convince anyone. They're simply sharing what they see. And when others don't understand, they don't feel the need to explain further, because deep down they already know that further explanation isn't going to work. And this creates a cycle. The person shares a profound insight. Others don't understand. The person stops sharing. Others perceive the person as cold, distant, maybe even arrogant. The person isolates even more. And the chasm grows. Now, Think about this from a neurological point of view. The highly sensitive person's brain is already overloaded with processing information. When they try to translate these complex perceptions into simple words, there's a massive loss of information. It's like trying to describe a symphony using only 3 notes. And when the person sees that the translation has failed, they simply give up. Not out of laziness, but out of energy conservation. Because explaining is exhausting when you already know it's not going to work. Research on resting state brain connectivity has shown something absolutely fascinating. Highly sensitive people exhibit increased connectivity within the ventral attention networks, the dorsal attention network, and the limbic network. But here's the crucial detail. They also show weaker connectivity between the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray matter, which is important for modulating pain and anxiety, and weaker connectivity between the hippocampus and the insula, implicated in habitual cognitive processing. What does this mean in practice? It means that the highly sensitive person's brain can't create habits the same way that the average brain can. Each experience is processed as if it were brand new. Each stimuli is analyzed in depth. There's no autopilot that most people use to navigate their day-to-day lives. And this explains why highly sensitive people report overstimulation and increased anxiety. They're literally processing more information, with less ability to automate responses. But here comes the part that Andrew Huberman rarely mentions, but that Carl Jung predicted with impressive accuracy. The highly sensitive person's brain doesn't just process more information. It processes information differently, while the neurotypical brain categorizes quickly and moves on. The highly sensitive person's brain actively seeks connections, patterns, deeper meanings. Carl Jung called this the inferior function. He explained that each psychological type has a dominant function and an inferior function, which operates in a more primitive and unconscious way. For the introverted intuitive, the inferior function is extroverted sensation. This essentially means that a person who lives in the world of internal possibilities has difficulty with the practical details of the external world, and this creates a constant dissonance. The person perceives cosmic patterns, but forgets where they put their keys. They see connections between distant ideas, but have difficulty following a superficial conversation. They understand the essence of a person in seconds, but can't remember names and dates. Others see this as distraction, disorganization, a lack of practicality. But what's really happening is a different allocation of cognitive resources, and neuroscience is proving this. Studies show that the default mode network, the brain network active during introspective thought and self-reflection, operates differently in highly sensitive people. This network is more connected, more active, more integrated with other brain networks. This means that the highly sensitive person is constantly in a mode of deep reflection, even when they appear to be just sitting in silence. Back to Carl Jung. He described 4 main psychological functions. Sensation and intuition are perceptive functions, non-rational. Thinking and feeling are judging functions, rational. The introverted intuitive has intuition as their dominant function, and it's directed inward. This means that this person is constantly picking up patterns and possibilities from the inner world, from the unconscious, from what has not yet been manifested. And Carl Jung was very clear about one thing. Intuition is perception via the unconscious, using sensory perception only as a starting point. It brings to the surface ideas, images, possibilities, solutions to blocked situations, through a process that is overwhelmingly unconscious. The person can't always explain how they arrived at a conclusion. They simply know, and when they try to explain, the explanation sounds incomplete, vague, even mystical, and others don't trust what they can't understand logically. Now let's connect this with what Andrew Huberman teaches about neuroplasticity. He explains that neuroplasticity is an incredible characteristic of our nervous system that allows it to change in response to experience. It's possibly one of the most important aspects of our biology. But here's the problem. Neuroplasticity requires focused attention. And the highly sensitive person often has difficulty focusing because they're picking up everything at the same time. So while the average person can easily direct attention to a task and develop new neural circuits through repeated practice, the highly sensitive person is constantly being pulled in multiple directions by all the stimuli they're perceiving. And this affects the capacity for change, not because the person doesn't want to change, but because the very mechanism of change requires a type of sustained focus that the highly sensitive person's brain has difficulty maintaining. And this is where generic self-help advice fails miserably for these individuals. Just focus. Just ignore distractions. Just be more practical. This advice assumes a neurotypical brain. A brain that can easily filter stimuli and direct attention. But for the highly sensitive person, that's like asking a fish to walk. It simply wasn't built that way. Let me tell you about a study that really struck me. Researchers discovered that when highly sensitive people see images of their romantic partners smiling, compared to images of strangers smiling, they show significantly greater activation in brain regions associated with empathy, awareness and integration of sensory information, and that's compared to people with average sensitivity looking at the same images. What does this reveal? That the highly sensitive person isn't just feeling more. They're processing on a completely different level. Each social interaction is an immersive experience. Each emotional connection is profound. And when that depth isn't reciprocated, the pain is also proportional. Let me explain something that most psychologists don't understand, but that neuroscience is starting to confirm. The highly sensitive person doesn't choose to feel deeply. Their brain is wired for it from birth. And when they connect with someone, when they open their inner world to another person, they are making a massive neurobiological investment. Oxytocin, the love hormone, is released in larger quantities. Dopamine creates deeper reward pathways. The prefrontal cortex forms more complex relational maps. And when that connection is broken or unreciprocated, the brain experiences it as a literal wound. Neuroimaging studies show that the pain of rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. And for the highly sensitive person, that activation is amplified. And that's why highly sensitive people need more time to recover from relationships. It's not drama. It's not weakness. It's neurochemistry. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about nervous system regulation, about how the nervous system can be trained to better handle stress. But what he doesn't mention is that the highly sensitive person's nervous system already starts in a state of higher activation. The baseline is already different. So, while the neurotypical person might use breathing techniques to get back to baseline in minutes, the highly sensitive person may need hours, or even days, to fully process an emotionally intense experience, and that's not a flaw. It's design. Carl Jung wrote something about this that few people know. He said that the introverted feeling type, which often overlaps with the introverted intuitive type, has deep, passionately intense feelings that may accompany secret religious or poetic leanings. But externally, the appearance is frequently neutral, cold, and dismissive, and that's exactly it. The depth is there, but the external expression doesn't match, and others see only the surface and judge based on IT. How many times have you been called cold when you were actually feeling intensely, but simply didn't know how to express it? How many times has your silence been interpreted as disinterest when it was actually deep processing? This happens because emotional expression requires translation. And for the highly sensitive brain, that translation is complex. The internal experience is so rich, so multidimensional, that any attempt at verbalization feels inadequate. It's better to remain silent than to be misunderstood. But silence also comes at a cost: isolation, loneliness. The feeling that you exist on a frequency that no one else picks up. Researchers estimate that about 20% of the world's population possesses the trait of high sensory processing sensitivity. That's roughly 4 billion people. 4 billion people who process the world differently, who feel more deeply, who perceive more details, and who often feel alienated in a world that seems designed for neurotypical brains. Carl Jung was right over 100 years ago, and neuroscience is finally proving it. But here's the part that no one talks about. This heightened sensitivity isn't just a burden, it's also an extraordinary capacity. Research shows that highly sensitive people make better decisions because they process more information before acting. They are more empathetic because they pick up on emotional nuances that others ignore. They're more creative because they see connections that others don't perceive. The same brain that causes exhaustion and overstimulation is also capable of profound insights, meaningful connections, and unique contributions to the world. The problem was never the brain. The problem was trying to make that brain function like others, trying to fit a three-dimensional experience into a world that operates in two dimensions. Carl Jung knew this. He wrote that the introverted intuitive can be an artist or a visionary, someone who brings visions from the inner world to the outer world, someone who serves as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. And that's the purpose, not to fit in, to translate. The task of the highly sensitive brain isn't to become less sensitive. It's to find ways to translate its unique perception to a world that desperately needs those perceptions. But how to do this in practice? Let me give you a hybrid protocol that combines what Carl Jung taught with what Andrew Huberman's neuroscience has validated. First, accept that you need more recovery time. Andrew Huberman talks about the importance of sleep for memory consolidation and emotional processing. For the highly sensitive brain, this is even more critical. It's not a luxury, it's a biological necessity. Second, find forms of expression that don't depend on the immediate understanding of others. Carl Jung recommended active imagination, a process of dialogue with the unconscious through writing, art, or meditation. Neuroscience shows that this practice strengthens the connections between the default mode network and other brain networks, improving the integration between reflective thought and action. Third, choose carefully with whom you share your depth. Carl Jung wrote that the introverted intuitive learns to keep things to themselves because they have been misunderstood so many times. But this doesn't mean total isolation. It means strategic selectivity. Fourth, use the body as an anchor. Andrew Huberman emphasizes that the state of the body influences the state of the mind. For the highly sensitive brain, practices like controlled breathing, cold exposure, or physical exercise can help regulate the overactive nervous system, not to suppress sensitivity, but to create a stable foundation from which it can operate. Fifth, recognize that your unique perception has value. Society needs people who see what others don't see. It needs advanced senses that pick up on nuances, patterns, new possibilities. It needs translators between the visible and the invisible world. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying these individuals because he was one of them. He lived the experience of seeing things that others couldn't, of knowing things he couldn't prove, of sensing truths that couldn't be contained in words. And he found his purpose translating these perceptions for an audience that gradually learned to listen to him. Andrew Huberman, while he doesn't directly address psychological types, acknowledges that individual differences exist in how brains process information. He frequently mentions that protocols that work for most may not work for everyone. And this is especially true for the highly sensitive brain. The most common mistake that people with this type of brain make is trying to completely adapt to the neurotypical world. It's trying to suppress their sensitivity to fit in. It's like trying to make a piano function like a drum set. You might manage it for a while, but you're squandering what the instrument really does best. Let me tell you something that changed my perspective on all of this. Carl Jung wrote in his memoirs that during his childhood, he felt he carried two worlds within him. One world was that of external reality, of school, of family, of social expectations. The other world was an internal universe of visions, intuitions, and perceptions that no one around him seemed to share. He spent years thinking something was wrong with him, that he was odd, that he should hide this part of himself. It was only as an adult, after years of study and exploration, that he understood that this ability to perceive two worlds was not a defect. It was his greatest gift. It was the foundation of everything he would contribute to human psychology. The concept of the collective unconscious, the archetypes, individuation, the shadow, all of this came from a man who spent his entire life translating perceptions that most people couldn't access. And he was only able to do this because he stopped trying to be like others, because he accepted that his way of processing reality was different, and because he found a way to translate that difference into something the world could use. Today's neuroscience is increasingly validating what Carl Jung intuited, that the human brain exists on a spectrum of sensitivity, that some people are born with neural systems that pick up more, process more deeply, feel more intensely, and that these people are not defective. They're different, and different, in the context of the evolution of human consciousness, often means necessary. In the comments, write down what age you realized you thought differently. Write down the moment you knew, without a doubt, that your brain worked in a way that others didn't understand. I want to know how many of you had this realization in childhood, and how many only discovered it in adulthood. And if you know someone who spent their entire life feeling misunderstood, someone who needs to know that there's nothing wrong with their brain, share this video, because these truths that Carl Jung revealed, and that Andrew Huberman validated, need to reach those who need to hear them most. Carl Jung dedicated his life to studying these psychological types. He knew that the world needed all forms of perception, that cognitive diversity was not a bug in the system, but an essential feature for the evolution of human consciousness. And now, more than 100 years later, you're part of that story. You're one of the 1/4 billion. You carry a brain that was built to perceive what others don't perceive, to feel what others don't feel, to know what others don't yet know. Misunderstanding isn't your destiny, it's your phase, until you find the others who speak the same language, until you discover you're not alone, until you realize that being different isn't being defective, it's being exactly what the world needs.